Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 5 of the Better Death Collective podcast, where we'll ask the complicated and uncomfortable question: what do we do when a loved one dies? Of course, as many of us know, as deaths can often come under tragic and sudden circumstances, there is no one clear answer. But our very own Ed Bixby, a well-known and highly experienced cemeterian, has seen it all and will give us the knowledge to help us each put a plan in place, or at the very least, help us prepare mentally for the day we're forced to lay a loved one to rest. So let's get right into it with our in-house expert on after-death care, Ed Bixby.
Hi everyone, Ed Bixby here from the Better Death Collective along with Matt Connell. Welcome.
Hi there.
Welcome. Today what we want to do is talk to you a little bit about what you would do if a family member were to pass away suddenly. What we have experienced is that, people aren't ready for the conversation, nor obviously for the task when someone passes away unexpectedly. And what we would like to do is inform you as to what you should expect, and maybe even convince you to consider talking about prearrangement, letting your wishes be known so that, if something like this were to happen to you or a family member, it would be a little bit easier on you. So I'm going to do a lot of talking today, and Matt's going to kind of listen in and hopefully ask some questions that you might be thinking. But I think you'll appreciate this because we've all had loved ones who have passed, and we know how hard that can be. So what I want to do is I'm going to take you right through the process from the beginning to the end, from the moment of passing, to the funeral director, to the cemetery, and even after. So with all that being said, when someone passes, they may be in the hospital, they may be at home. You just never know. I'm going to go through the two different scenarios, one being at home and one being in the hospital, and I'll kind of, go along with both at the same time. So when someone passes away at home, it's not necessary that they go to the hospital itself. What people need to know is that, believe it or not, one of the first things that you need to do is have the individual pronounced. That's really important. So, for instance, if they were in, say, like hospice care, they would understand that they're going to pass away and they would be ready for something like this. So when your loved one would pass away unexpectedly at home, you would call, maybe say 911, or the hospital itself, and say, I've had a loved one pass. They will instruct you to call maybe the local authorities, whoever would be in charge of that in your local municipality. You would call them, tell them of the passing, and they would actually send out possibly, an ambulance or someone that could pronounce the individual. Typically, a doctor or somebody with the licensing that can say that someone has actually passed away. So if they come out and it's obvious that the individual has passed away, they may do one of two different things. They may say, well, this person's had underlying heart conditions in the past or something to that effect. And maybe they will say, we're gonna pronounce them as that, something like that has occurred. And then they could release them to the funeral director. Or they may say that they would call for possibly something like an autopsy if they thought it was suspicious. But no matter what ends up happening, you have to have your loved one pronounced before they can be moved out of the home. So, you have to have this professional come, make that determination. And at that point, you're able to call the funeral director, or that funeral professional will advise you as to what's next. In the hospital setting, it's very similar, obviously. If someone dies in the hospital and say that they came in for chest pains, or again, they may determine a cause of death based upon what was happening to you, or maybe someone had, an illness, long-term illness. If someone passes away and it seems in any way suspicious, then at that point in time, they may call for an autopsy. So I would like you to know your rights concerning an autopsy, because that can be a bit traumatic for individuals when it comes to their loved ones. Certainly it's an invasive type of procedure, and most certainly I don't think anyone wants their loved one to be autopsied, unless it's absolutely necessary. So with all that being said, if your loved one was, say, found outside of the house, with a bump on their head, and they had passed away, then more than likely they're going to say this is suspicious, and they're going to call for something like that. But say, like, for instance, your loved one has an underlying condition. Maybe they're allergic to something, or maybe they've lived a life, where you guys are familiar with what is going on, but others may not be. Please make your physicians and healthcare workers make it known. Be sure to convey that message to them so they understand and they can look for those types of things. Signs of maybe like anaphylactic shock or whatever that may be. But know this, sometimes mistakes are made, and sometimes they ask for autopsies when it's not necessary. So do know that, you do have rights, and, a religious right is a very big part of that. So if that's something you're against and they're not forcing it, exercise your religious right, say that religiously, you don't accept this and that you won't allow it. And hopefully, that can avoid a situation if it's not necessary. But with that all being said, when someone passes in the hospital, the good news is they're in a very safe place. So what they'll do is they'll take them down to the mortuary or the morgue, and they will place them under refrigeration. And then at that point in time, you'll receive the different things that you need, like the pronouncement, and then they'll instruct you when you can or cannot call a funeral director to come retrieve your loved one. So that's kind of, what you need to know about when someone passes away and what you might expect, whether it be sudden or whether, you're expecting it. There are a few things that need to be done, and just be sure that you know your rights and that you do those things in a timely fashion, because what upsets a lot of families a lot of times is they don't understand this, and their loved one may pass away at home, and they may be there for 5, 6, 10, 12 hours, and they might be like, why has no one come to retrieve them? And it's because certain things haven't been done. So with that being said, I'll move on, but I want to know if Matt's listening here intently. So if you got any questions, let me know.
I do have a question. When it comes to an autopsy, what is the reason that people are so hesitant to have their loved one autopsied? What is the main reason, I should say? Does it mean that the body will likely not be presentable? Or is it just is it religious? Is it, just the thought of having your loved one kind of open up, or is it all of the above? What do you think?
I think, you've hit all the points. I would say that, you could divide all of those up probably equally. And it would probably mean all the reasons why people don't want it. I would say, for me personally, one of the largest reasons for my families would be that they don't want their loved one touched in that way or disturbed in that way. They feel as if it's too invasive. And unfortunately, with an autopsy, there's many things that are required. And like when I say that, like an autopsy, sometimes, almost all the time, you have to remove organs that maybe are not associated with the actual death itself. So I think the way families look at it is it's just far too invasive, and they don't want to see that happen to their loved one. But I've heard it all, though. You named all the top ones.
Well, when it comes to these kinds of decisions, and to have the wherewithal in that moment to be able to call the hospital and say, no autopsy, please, and to be able to enact a plan under that type of grief, where you're devastated, you're completely immobilized in many cases, I would imagine. Would it be a good idea to kind of have another person handle this for you, like a family member or a close friend?
No, absolutely. So what'll happen is, if certainly that happens quite a bit, people are too grief stricken. What will have to happen would be that the person in charge, or the next of kin, would have to instruct them that they had permission to speak, to that family member, and that family member actually has the ability to make decisions. You may have to intermittently speak. There might be questions where they need a definitive answer from you personally, but they will most certainly, work with anyone that you appoint, that duty. But like I said, there are just a few little things that have to come from the direct next of kin. But, it can be a yes or no situation opposed to trying to, discuss these matters, in the moment.
Sure, sure.
So, I mean, I think that everyone should have a plan. Nobody really wants to think about having a plan, but having things like an advance directive or a will, but advance directive might be a little more suited for this matter, where your loved ones actually know what your wishes are. Again, even if you're healthy, you should. Tomorrow's never promised, so we should always have a plan, and we owe it to our loved ones to do that. So I encourage that portion.
Yeah, it's easier to have a plan for grandma and grandpa than it is for a child, I would imagine.
Oh,
You
absolutely,
know?
absolutely. I mean, there's nothing harder than having to lay a child to rest. For the family, for the funeral director, for the cemeterian, it's a very difficult situation. No matter what, you do. But I have some other things here that might be more helpful for people, so they know that they have the rights to different options that might make it easier for them in those tragic instances. Like if I were to move to like what you do after the actual passing, you're either going to have to make a decision. By legal right, believe it or not, you can have your loved one at home once they're able to be moved from a location or they're pronounced. Or you can choose to have them go to the funeral home. Prior to the Civil War, everyone was at home, from the dawn of time or wherever they may have lived. In modern day, people are a little more used to the funeral home setting. What you have to think about, and hopefully you can think about it while you're living, is what would be more suited for you and your family. With the home funeral setting, certainly you have much more time, intimate time to spend with your loved one, but you may not be comfortable with some of the things that are involved with someone when they pass, and we can talk a little bit about that. Opposed to how the funeral home can come pick up your loved one, and that they're caring for them in that way, but then I do talk to lots of families where the people feel removed. They feel as if they wish they had more of the time, with the loved one. So if you're going to have a loved one at home, and it can happen, and you can use a funeral director to help you through this process. Don't think you're alone in that. Once you have the ability, either to keep them home or if they're in the hospital setting, have them sent home, you have to realize that within all the states in North America, in the United States, I should say, embalming is not required. Certainly, you can embalm your loved one if you wish, but what you do have to do is refrigerate them, and then probably within 40 of the states, refrigeration has to happen within 48 hours, the time of passing. Some states it's 24, so you have to, depending on where you live, I think you should do a little research. So what you have to understand is if you're going to keep someone at home, that you have to have some sort of refrigeration, dry ice, something like that works perfectly fine. You can hire a funeral home or a funeral director to assist you with this. If your loved one goes to the funeral home itself, of course, they have necessary refrigeration and things like that can care for your loved one. So if they're going to be unembalmed, the funeral home can care for them in that way. But if they're going to be embalmed, then that they can do that process, and refrigeration isn't necessary. Body preparation, this is what I tell families. If you choose to have your loved one at home, you have to understand that there are some things that can happen with the body when someone expires that might be not so pleasant. And you really, if you're going to keep them at home, you really truly want it to be a memorable experience. I know that sounds kind of strange to say, but you have to realize you're celebrating that life that was lived. You're spending time with that loved one, the final act of kindness. But you may not be prepared to care for the body in certain ways. Depending on how someone passes away, there can be gas buildup, there can be leakage, there can be things that, again, that I don't want to scare anybody by saying it, but it's a fact. So
Right.
It really comes down to your comfort level. And a lot of times it would come down to, how the person passed away. So for instance, if someone were to pass away at home in a manner that, say they weren't ill and they just passed away naturally, it may be very easy to keep them home and not have to worry about a lot of things that may happen. At the hospital, if someone's, say, ill and they're pumped with a lot of fluids for many, many days, there can be a lot of problems with things like leakage. And you would be best at that point, in particular, if you're going to keep them at home, is to really seek out the help of a professional like a death doula or a funeral director that can assist you through the process. Most certainly, if they go to the funeral home and say they are traditionally embalmed, and then a lot of these things are taken care of, and it's going to be a non-issue. But just be prepared, that there are some things that could occur, and not trying to scare anybody, but it has to be said. But I've known many, many families who've done it, and it's changed their lives to be able to have that more intimate setting and spend a little more quality time with their loved one before they have to say their final goodbye.
Absolutely.
So the body prep is important. It can be done at home, the washing of the body, any of the things that need to be done. Again, it could be done at the funeral home as well. If you're going to casket or shroud your loved one, you can purchase a casket or a shroud from a funeral director. Believe it or not, you can purchase these things online. Of course, everything can be bought online nowadays. You can even fashion your own. You can make it out of your own favorite quilt or blanket. You can, if you're handy, you can build your own pine box. The funeral director themselves, they certainly will be able to offer you all types of different products and different types of caskets and things like that. So that would be something that the funeral home that, if that was something you wanted them to handle, they do it on a daily basis. It's very easy for them to do. So you'd have the body prep, the casketing, and the shrouding, and then you'd come down to the viewing. Some people want to have a viewing, some people do not. Sometimes you can have a viewing, sometimes you cannot. It really depends again on how the individual passes away, your comfort level as to if you want them viewed or if you do not want them viewed. But know this, direct family members at any point in time, can absolutely view the body as long as they understand the circumstances. No one's going to tell you that you can't. You just have to understand that it may not be a pleasant experience if certain things have happened to an individual. Say it's a tragic death, and everyone listening to this can understand that. So that would probably cover the bases as far as a home funeral. And a funeral home funeral, all the way up to the actual day of visitation. The one thing I didn't mention was that, with a natural burial, typically by the time you receive things like permits and all that kind of stuff, it may be 3 to 5 days before you can actually inter or choose something like cremation for your loved one. So remember that, during this process, that's one thing I didn't cover, actually, and let me go back a little bit. The funeral director themselves play a really important role in this. Individuals can get the permits required to move a body. There's a transportation permit and there is a burial permit. But it's much easier for the funeral professional to get these. They're kind of dialed in. So if you do choose to do it at home, you may want to speak to a funeral provider and hire them for that service, because before someone can be transported, you do have to have a transportation permit. Before they can be buried or a final disposition, you do need that permit. The other thing the funeral director will do as well is they'll get you the proper amount of death certificates. A lot of people don't realize that when someone passes, you need about 8 to 10 of these typically, because unfortunately with the government agencies and things like that, you're going to have to be sending a lot of those out. So instead of like worrying about it at a later date and, oh my goodness, how do I get more of them? They'll say to you, you should get this many. If you do it on your own, remember that, that when you're getting these permits, talk to your local registrar. That's who you would contact, is your vital statistics registrar in your municipality. Tell them what you're doing, and then also ask them about the death certificates so that they can provide them to you. That'll make it a lot easier for you.
Well, what would happen if somebody did not go through that process and just kind of took it upon themselves to just move forward without any paperwork or anything like that? I mean, are there consequences to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a very good question, Matt, and I'm glad you brought it up. So, I do get a lot of families who don't realize this and kind of want to move forward, in particular in the natural setting. And unfortunately, by law, these things have to be done. And there's a lot of reasons for it. I mean, in particular, imagine, I hate to say things crazy like this, but, when someone's dies suspiciously, that's what they're looking at. They want to be sure that this individual has passed away and there has been no funny business, that everything is in order. In particular as well, a lot of people will collect benefits. Maybe it's Social Security, maybe it's a pension. They don't want people collecting those after someone has passed away. It's happened quite a bit, believe me. People have done these things on their own. And if a cemetery is going to take an internment without a permit, they're actually doing something illegal. So just understand that there would be consequences. I don't know that anyone would be arrested, but what I will tell you is, if you don't make people aware and they find out, they could make you exhume a body. They could make you do some things that would be uncomfortable that you wouldn't want to do. And you certainly wouldn't want to disturb the rest of your loved one, if that were to happen. So very good question.
Well, one other thing that you had mentioned were tragic deaths, where, a viewing is just not possible or not, a good idea. So if somebody has in their plans a home funeral with the home viewing, and they do pass away in a traffic accident where there's, a viewing is not possible, what happens in those circumstances? Do people need to have alternatives put in place for their plans, or are there ways through that? Are there ways around it? Because I imagine a funeral home is much better equipped for sanitation and stuff like that, whereas a home is not. And a funeral director is better skilled at that sort of thing than just the average Joe. What happens in those situations?
Well, that's a very good question as well. So I mean, I've had to deal with this on many, many occasions. So if someone's going to be at home and they've passed away, like you said, in, let's say for instance, an automobile accident, and say things like leakage and things like that are a problem, it can still happen. But what would happen would be that you would seek the help of a professional, like a funeral director, and then they would prepare the body in a way that those things would not become a problem for the family itself. So there are drying agents, there are gauzes, there are lots of different things that can be done to prevent those types of things to happen. The only difficulty with that is that you may not obviously be able to view your loved one actually after the body is prepared. So, for instance, like even wax paper, believe it or not, is used, in natural settings. During COVID, unfortunately, we didn't know what would or wouldn't happen with COVID in the beginning. So, here in the New York, New Jersey metropolitan area where my primary residence is, we were hit in the very beginning of this. And we had to bury people, believe it or not, in what's called a disaster bag. And a disaster bag is made out of Tyvek. And they did not want to spread the virus. They didn't want the people that were handling the body to potentially get it. And what we did, at my facilities was accept the fact that we were going to bury this, even though it was, not biodegradable, because the individuals who had passed away from COVID didn't choose to pass away from COVID, and they chose a natural burial. And to pay, out of respect to them, we would not deny them of that wish. But with that long explanation being said, even in the home setting, what is considered what's called a disaster bag, it's not a very good name, obviously to use, but that's what the industry calls it. That would be something they could use as well. And maybe they would be in one of those, and they might be shrouded and then in a pine box or in a traditional casket. So it can be done, but it's just, you're going to need a professional in that, in that circumstance.
Sure. Yeah, I can imagine so.
So we'll move on now quickly to cremation, just so everybody knows. So, the whole same process would hold true to cremation, depending on whether or not, you wanted to spend time with your loved one. And, you could have a home vigil and then they could go to the crematory, or you could have a viewing and you could have a celebration at the funeral home and then they would go, to the crematory. The one thing that everyone needs to understand about that, though, is that once someone is cremated, believe it or not, that's considered the final disposition. So the cremated remains actually are they are personal property, which is a little bizarre to say, but it is. So at that point, either the funeral director will ask you to come pick it up, or the crematory will mail it to you. And then at that point, you can make a decision as to how you want to handle your loved one's cremains. So, a lot of people choose things like scattering or, maybe putting them in their own backyard. There are certain laws and restrictions that surround cremains, but it really surrounds the funeral industry, not the individual. So, an individual can get permission to scatter on private property, and you wouldn't need any kind of, you wouldn't need, when I say permission from the owner, not even from anyone else. So you have to check your local laws concerning cremated remains, but they become personal property. If they're going to go into a cemetery space, then you don't have to get any special permitting. But we as cemeterians, because of the nature of who we are, we have to treat them in a way that is an individual, and we can't take those cremains and do anything other than exactly what you would, you ask us to do with them. Inter them, put them in a columbarium. We can scatter, or we can even plant a tree like we do with natural burial. So just understand that with cremation, you can do the home, you can do the viewing at the, you can do the home vigil, you can do the viewing at the funeral home, and then, then it'll go to the crematory, or you can choose something called direct cremation, which would be literally taking that individual from the home or from the funeral home or from the hospital directly to the crematory. But the problem with that is it's very inexpensive, but you lose a lot of memorialization and celebration. So before you make a choice like that, think about it a little bit. I mean, it's certainly fine if you want to do it, but, it's a real final act when it comes to cremation.
Yeah, that's actually something that has come up here in Minnesota. I've heard of people saying that they want their ashes to be scattered in their favorite lake that they would fish in. Put me in the Mississippi River, put me in Lake Superior, put me in Lake Minnetonka, and people say, "Great, that's beautiful, that's great," but that's actually, from what I understand, you can't just do that. Is that?
Yeah, you're
true?
Absolutely correct. So there's a lot of heavy metals within cremains. You may have had fillings and all kinds of different things that could introduce things like lead or mercury into a freshwater environment. So they don't allow you to scatter remains in any freshwater lakes or estuaries in the entire United States. And believe it or not, when we scatter, we have to go 3 nautical miles into the ocean before we do so. So just know that. I mean, Most certainly people do that all the time, but do realize there could be an environmental impact if you do it. We don't want to introduce those types of things that will then have a negative impact on on that freshwater lake environment or river environment. So just realize that we as humans, we live a long life. Dental amalgams and all those types of things can actually be bad, so we have to be sure it's done correctly. So that was a good question, Matt, and that's good for people to know, just so they don't get themselves in trouble. You don't want to go out on a boat in Lake Superior, like you said, and have a game warden come up and say, "Hey, what you doing?"
Yeah.
Well, Dad always wanted to be in my favorite fishing spot. You might find yourself in a little hot water with that.
I can imagine so. Yeah, and I kind of wonder what the charges would be. And as a Coast Guard guy, you're probably like, "Oh, geez, I hate to find these people," but then their hands are tied. It's just and these people were probably completely oblivious to the fact that what they're doing is maybe not totally safe. So tough situation.
No, you're absolutely right. But in the ground, burial of cremains is perfectly legal. Scattering above the ground, as long as you're on private property or you obtain a permit for, you can even go to state property in many instances, believe it or not, if you get the proper permit from the state agency. So these things can be done. Like somebody could go to their favorite forest, and maybe it's a state forest where they hunted their whole life, and investigate it. You may be able to receive a scattering permit. They are able to do those things, whether or not they actually permit it. That's going to be per facility. But good things to know about cremation. And then, of course, we have the cemetery. So after you have the home and the hospital and the funeral home, then you have the cemetery setting. And what we require, we're cemeterians, so we can speak, to this pretty accurately. What we require are burial permits. So if you're going to arrive at a cemetery, the first and foremost thing that I need is a burial permit, because at that point I know you've done all the legal things that were necessary to be able to come to me. So you've received your pronouncement, you received your transportation permit, and now you present me with a burial permit. The funeral director can present me with a burial permit. When you contact the county registrar, if you do it on your own, you just tell them the name of the facility and they'll type that into the permit itself. So that's just one thing you need to know. You don't want to show up without it and have somebody say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I can't do this." It's happened. People have left them at home. So we want that to be something that you're aware of. In cemeteries, some cemeteries require a vault, some do not. Some have areas that are vaultless and vaulted. So, when you're looking into these different options, find out what the cemetery requires. If you do not want to be in an outer burial container, then you can certainly be buried in a shroud or a pine box or anything like that. Even a steel casket, believe it or not, if it's a non-eco-friendly funeral cemetery, just a regular cemetery, if they don't require vaults, you can actually put them directly in the ground. Vaults are not there to preserve the body or protect the body. It's actually for the landscape. A lot of people don't understand that. That's so that there's no settling. So, they place someone in a vault, and then they put the dirt back on top and tamp it, and they lay down the sod, and then they don't have to go back. So it's really a maintenance tool. So just realize that, that it can be expensive, and you may not want to absorb that cost, or you may not believe in it. They're not waterproof, believe me. Plenty of vaults that are exhumed or full of water. So just understand those things before you make that decision. You have to make the decision. What's that?
I sorry to cut you off. I learned something interesting yesterday. I was at a funeral home in Rochester, Minnesota, and I was speaking to the funeral director there, and they're trying to get the word out about green burial and making sure people understand that this is an option. But he said that often people in the city of Rochester are disappointed to find out, when they ask for a green burial, that the city of Rochester actually requires a vault no matter what. And so they have to perform these green burials that are, not what somebody might consider 100% green.
Right.
Because the city actually requires the vault. And I had to think about it. He wasn't exactly sure what the origin of that law came from, but he said it was most likely landscaping. They maybe didn't want people to see evidence of a body in the ground. But he wanted people to be aware that that was a fact. If you want a green burial in this city, you need a vault. So,
And Matt, I'm glad you brought that up, because, there are a lot of cemeteries that do require it. I want everyone watching this to know these are cemetery requirements, not laws, not governmental laws. The city of Rochester, they have the ability to enforce that, and they have the ability to say that you don't need it. So they can change their own requirements in their cemeteries. So, but there's no state law ever requiring a vault anywhere. And the interesting thing you just said about a natural burial with a vault, for the listeners, you might say to yourself, well, how do you do that? Well, they invert it. They turn it upside down. There's no lid. So the individual is placed on the ground, and then the vault is placed over top of them. So just for your knowledge, that's how they actually perform that. But also know that, if you can't find a natural burial ground in your neighborhood, go to your local cemetery if they require vaults, and just say, hey, listen, would you consider not requiring them in a certain section? And believe it or not, more than likely they'll say yes. So it's just a matter of, you got to ask for it. So thank you for bringing that up. The other thing that people might have to decide is whether or not they want a natural or a traditional funeral setting at a cemetery. With a natural setting, so people understand, you can carry your loved one to the gravesite. You can place them on what would be wooden planks with hemp ropes. You can lower them down. You can be part of the process. With a traditional setting, that's where you see the lowering device, and that's where the maintenance crew may carry your loved one and place them on it, and then they'll hit a little switch, and then the casket will lower. So you just have to think about, what you want as far as family involvement is concerned. A lot of people aren't very familiar with being involved in it because we've lost touch with it, but just understand that being part of it in a natural setting or even a traditional setting that allows the family to do it is a real life-changing experience. It's a real cathartic event. It helps release a lot of the pain and the grief. So consider being part of that. And if some cemeteries will not allow you to touch a shovel. Some cemeteries will allow you to backfill the entire grave. Again, give it some thought. If you don't want that mechanical aspect, if you don't want a big backhoe to come in and possibly push the dirt in, if you want to gently return it by a shovel, talk to your cemetery about that, whether it's a natural or traditional cemetery. You might be surprised that how, they embrace the concept and let you do it. So I think that's important to know. And then you got to think about monumentation. You have a couple different kinds of monumentation. Of course, we have the traditional, which are the polished upright monuments, or maybe it's the lawn cemetery, and it could be bronze. And they can be, they can be beautiful, but they can be expensive. They can be timely, meaning like, when you install them, you have to install what would be a concrete footing, and then they have to come back and install the actual stone itself. Sometimes people prefer to have these things done at the same time, if it's possible. With a traditional monument, that's really not possible. So just understand that, you will have to go back and you will have to do some things after the fact. With a natural burial or even a traditional burial that chooses a non-traditional monument, if you used something like a field stone, it could be placed the day of. If you wanted to make something out of wood, it could be engraved, it could be painted. There's a lot of different options when it comes to monumentation. You could even plant something living. You can plant a tree as a living memorial. You have to ask your cemetery and see if that's something they're willing to accept. I will tell you this, that at any of my facilities, if someone wants a tree, I would love to accommodate it, because it's a wonderful way to landscape the cemetery and make it a beautiful place for the people who visit. You might have to have a little eye for detail. They might say to you, well, we might, we'll allow a tree over here or over there, but maybe not here because it might not be conducive, for a tree. But keep that in mind. Monumentation is important. And then there's there's alternative dispositions, and I won't go too deeply into that, but we'll have some further podcasts in the future. There's things called aquamation, which is water cremation, or its technical name is alkaline hydrolysis. It's a cremation process that's non-fire based, which listeners may find very interesting, and is now licensed in about 25 states, so it's growing in popularity. There is natural organic reduction. That is where someone is placed in a chamber of organic material, and basically they're turned into organic material, and then the bones are treated very similarly to the cremation process, and then that can be reintroduced, back to nature. People are really interested in that. There are a multitude of sea options. Things like, full body burial at sea, believe it or not, it's available to people. You have to be within 600 foot of water. Remember that, no matter where you're at in the continental United States, you have to be within 600 foot of water. But that's an option. And I don't know about the Great Lakes. I don't know. That would be something you might have to look up. I know they don't allow cremains. Deep. The Great Lakes are pretty deep. They may or may not. That would be something you'd have to check into. A lot of times.
Yeah, I'm not sure. They are protected. I know they have their own special legal protection. But honestly, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, it may. It's funny. That may be something. And you and I will look into it. That might be possible. Mm-hmm. You could find out by calling, believe it or not, the Coast Guard or the Navy. And believe it or not, the Navy does this for free in certain locations. The only problem is you have to wait until certain times of the year. So that's something you can do for a loved one if they love the ocean, or if they were in the Navy or in the Coast Guard or Marines. They may want a full body burial at sea, and it may be actually gratis, depending on their circumstances. Obviously, if you're in the military, you're able to get a lot of different benefits. What I should say to this group right now, so I don't forget, is that also, even if you're not in the military, be sure that you have your funeral provider check into what death benefits you may be entitled to. Many people are entitled to death benefits and don't understand it. They may not be a lot of money, but they may be very helpful. Like, for instance, in the state of New Jersey, there is, dependent on who you are, there's a death benefit of $1,500 with an additional $500 to the cemetery. So $1,500 to the funeral director, $500 to the cemetery. And if the family contributes a certain amount of money, then they contribute more. A lot of people never think to ask that question. Good funeral directors, and all funeral directors are good, but when I say good, I mean ones that are on top of their game thinking about this. they should be saying that to their families. They should really be saying, do you know what you're entitled to? Because that can make a big difference, because at this time of need, it's already hard enough. So remember that, talk to your funeral director about what death benefits you may be entitled to in your state or your province or wherever you may be. And then finally, aftercare. Everybody has a certain feeling when it comes to the passing of someone, and depending on how close you were to that person, don't ever be ashamed or feel funny about going to see someone to talk about those emotions, or figure out a way to find a better place for yourself when it comes to loss, because far too many people can fall into depression, and they can they can lose their will to live. It can be really a devastating thing. And what we have to remember is that, please, everyone listening, is that life is death is part of life. None of us can avoid it. Sometimes some of us are taken sooner than others, but you have to embrace the good times. You have to celebrate the life that was lived and not get locked with the agony and the despair of the passing. I know that's easier said than done, but just do yourself a favor. If you need aftercare, go talk to somebody. You'll feel better that you did. You'll come to a better understanding of what happened. And then you can live the life the way you should live it, knowing that the individual you lost would want you to continue to live your life that way. So just remember that. That's really important. And then I'll let you, Matt, because I've kind of wrapped up everything here in my portion. If you got anything else, let me know.
I have one more question. And one thing came to mind about people who make plans for a very customized send-off. Somebody who, one thing that, the most recent famous example that I can think of is my favorite author, Hunter S. Thompson, was blasted out of a cannon. They had Johnny Depp show up, put his ashes in the cannon, and they fired the cannon, and that was his send-off. And only as Hunter S. Thompson would. But for something like that, to have those kinds of plans in place, that's putting a lot on your loved ones. I would imagine that if you wanted something like that, then it's up to the individual to figure out the logistics of that. Is that accurate?
Yeah, you know what, Matt, and I'm glad you brought it up as the final portion of this. Yeah, absolutely. You're accurate in the sense that it can go one of two ways. I can't stress enough to the listeners to consider prearranging, or at least consider having the conversation with your family members. I know it's an uncomfortable one, but believe me, you'll feel better after you've done it. Talk about what you want. The logistics can easily be had if you understand what those logistics are. Investigate. If you want to be shot out of a cannon, more power to you. Just find out what the local laws are. And I'm sure there's plenty of people that would accommodate that for you. Realize that, it's not a conversation that's a scary one. It's a conversation that's a necessary one. Because remember this, it's not about you because you are gone. You've passed away. You're no longer here. It's about the ones you left behind. Give them that gift. Give them that gift of fond memories, not the tragedy of losing someone and being in despair and having that final event scar them for life, because it was just such a mess that they couldn't deal with it. So, that would be my final thought to the group.
Yeah, that's great. That's great advice. And I all of this is just awesome information. And I hope that people were helped by it as much as I was. I think this is all good stuff. And, no one wants to have to deal with the death of a loved one, especially when it's sudden and unexpected. But to be thinking about it and to have a plan in place in the back of your mind is just smart, because this is something that's inevitable, and we're all going to have to deal with it at some point.
Absolutely. Well, I thank everyone listening. I thank my co-host Matt Connell, and I'd ask everyone, all the listeners, support the Better Death Collective. Look forward to the next podcast, and we'll continue to bring you good education and good information.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ed. Great talk, and yeah, we'll see everybody again real soon. Thank you very much for watching and listening. Well, folks, we hope this helps. We know as well as anyone that talking about this sort of thing might fill someone with fear and fill our imagination with awful things. But we can't get around the fact that these things are real. Death and its aftermath are real. What we do need to get around is our general unwillingness to face these facts and discuss them, so that we can have the tools in place to properly honor our loved ones when their dying day arrives. This, of course, will be a conversation we'll continue to have in the future, with hopes that it's a conversation that you will continue to have in the future. Until then, thank you for listening. Please don't forget to follow us on social media, and we hope you'll listen to episode 6. After all, better death care takes a community.